Hello, and welcome to On Point. I'm Sarah Vong, and today we will be talking about how children learn about gender roles. Sociologists say societies influence children's understanding of masculine and feminine roles. Boys are expected to play with trucks and guns, while girls are expected to play with cooking sets and dolls. Now, some toy stores have removed gender signs, but at this particular store, the aisles still display boys' and girls' toys separately. Karen Stagg says she doesn't think change is necessary.
I think it's going a little far, but I guess in today's society and today's kids, they don't want them to be geared into one direction.
Now, children can watch a Barbie ad featuring a boy playing with the doll. The company says the ad celebrates self-expression, fashion, imagination, and storytelling, and the way boys and girls play together. But when children portray traits outside the expectations of society, they can be bullied. One parent at a local park says her son has experienced it.
One day he brought my purple water bottle to school, and he said a boy poured water in his lunchbox because he was using a girl's color water bottle. And so he asked if he didn't have to bring that to school anymore. So I was quite upset.
Another parent says not every child follows gender stereotypes.
Well, my girl is a tomboy, so she was never into princesses. She didn't like the Disney princesses. She loves the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and she loves Minecraft.
Scientists point to 4 major agents of socialization. The most influential is family, followed by education, peer groups, and mass media. On Point Stephanie Lopez has more.
Thank you, Sarah. Joining us today, we have Professor Denissen from the Sociology Department. We also have Dr. Kephart from the Communication Studies Department and Dr. Kouri from the Gender and Women's Studies Department. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's just get into it today. Are boys born wanting to play with trucks, and are girls born wanting to play with dolls? We'll start with you, Professor Denissen.
Well, the relationship between biology and the social world or culture and the production of gender is a fairly complex one. But something like wanting to play with a particular toy, we have really good research that demonstrates that that is something that's socially learned. It's not an innate or trait that or interest that we're born with. But it's something that children learn, gender, what they want to play with, and other aspects of gender, something they learn from a very, very young age, and continue to learn throughout our whole life course. So I can definitely say that the preference for trucks and that sort of thing is very much learned and reinforced. So children who have interests, so we might notice patterns, that boys are more likely to show an interest in playing with trucks and girls are more likely to show an interest in playing with dolls. And we might think from noticing that pattern that reflects some sort of biological reality or biological trait. But actually it's the production of learning those expectations and then having those expectations reinforced for children, either being rewarded for showing a correct sort of gender interest or being sanctioned for showing an interest in something that's not, seen as stereotypically as appropriate for one's gender.
So what are the differences between expectations for boys versus the expectations for girls? We'll start with you.
Those expectations get produced in a lot of different places, and the areas in which those expectations happen can shape what those expectations look like. So the difference between expectations you might get in school or popular culture through your church, one area in which they get shaped is in communication strategies. So the way that young boys or girls are encouraged to communicate. And that can start with things like the games they're encouraged to play when they're younger. So if young boys are encouraged to play games like cops and robbers or war or sports, things that tend to have clearly defined teams, specific rules and objectives, that encourages a pragmatic style of communication where young boys are encouraged to communicate to solve a problem and not to share emotions or not to establish connections or relationships. Young girls are often encouraged to play things like Tea Party or House or Dolls, where the form of communication is the point of the game is communication. So there is no winner at the tea party. And so when they're encouraged to do things like play with trucks that have a function that you're supposed to use it with versus play with dolls in which it's more of an imaginative or empathetic form of communication, that then also shapes how we expect young men and women to communicate.
Do you have anything else to add, Doctor?
Well, I just wanted to add, when the girls get older, though, they're taught to compete for men, just like
Absolutely.
the mystery date game I brought in for you to see. So one of the things girls are taught when they're growing up that boys aren't taught as much is the winner of the game is a guy, the winner of the game of life. And so the mystery date games, you know, the winner of those games is the girls that get the most guys to come to their party, and the one who can figure out which guy likes them. And so they're competing as they get older for men, and there's no comparable game for men or for boys about the winner of the game gets the most babes to come to their party. And so they're taught later on in life to compete for men.
And even things like the assertiveness with which they might compete gets valenced differently for men and women. So if being assertive in that game to compete and win might be okay, but being assertive in the workplace is very often devalued for women. In fact, women face many different expectations for what is considered successful communication. Men might be called leaders while women are called bossy, even though research demonstrates they're exhibiting the same traits. Even blind resumes. Women are not hired for positions in science and technology despite having identical resumes, and then expected to communicate differently once they get into the workplace. So it's not even, it doesn't even get to be consistent, right? The competition isn't always valued, but only in particular socially appropriate roles, like heteronormative expectations for competition over men, for example.
Right.
So how does growing up playing with gender-specific toys, like girls with cooking sets and dolls and boys with guns and fire trucks, does that affect their future job aspirations? Does that play a role for them to choose a career for their future? Professor Denissen?
If it plays a role, it's a very weak one. That doesn't mean that early gender socialization isn't important, and that the continued lifelong gender socialization isn't important. They are. But if you look at how people are sorted into careers, the supply side factors, which is things like the preferences of the job seekers, play a much weaker role than the demand side factors, which are the preferences of the employers. So when you look at things like occupational gender segregation and the gender pay gap, all of those inequalities are generally attributed to the actions of employers, the actions that are taking place in the workplace, including things, the one that you mentioned, about the sexism that we can see very clearly in a number of studies in the evaluation of job applicants, and how, you know, the same exact resume, if it has a male name, the person is more likely to be hired and to be paid more than if there's a female name on, or a woman's name on that exact same resume. So a lot of the gender inequalities are due, again, to the actions of employers and the institution of the workplace itself, rather than to these issues of gender socialization.
Yes, and the research shows us that when children are smaller, their job aspirations tend to be more gender stereotyped, but as they grow older, their job aspirations become more similar.
And if we compound that with the attitudes that people take once they get into the workplace, and so it's certainly not going to be playing with a gun or a truck automatically determines how you work in the workplace. But if a young boy is encouraged throughout his life to pursue science and technology in a way that young women aren't, and he's also encouraged to participate in largely male environments, to adopt aggressive and masculine communication styles, then in a workplace in which it is primarily male-dominated, such as technology, which tends to be 4-to-1 men to women, about 50% of women that enter those workplaces tend to leave, and they cite a hostile workplace environment as the reason.
Right.
And so they're tracked into it less in education, they're hired less for it structurally, and feel less comfortable able to communicate with coworkers once they're there. So it's rarely because they had a truck that happened, but that truck is part of what Susan Douglas describes as psychological spackle. Right, that it kind of fills in some of the gaps in other places and reinforces particular behaviors that cumulatively can produce some of these expectations and effects.
So what role does education play in helping form these gender stereotypes? Professor Denissen?
Well, I think it can vary. I think, unfortunately, in a lot of educational environments, the gender socialization continues. So when you have schools where there's a lot of gender segregated play, or gender segregated work groups, or gender segregated lining up girls, boys, or playing girls versus the boys, that sort of thing, then it can sort of, reinforce sort of stereotypical gendered ways of viewing the world. And when that carries over into the workplace, that can be, problematic, and it can lead to people perpetuating, double binds, going to see how that works out in the workplace. I'll go back to an example that you gave, but talk about it in terms of a gender double bind. So the problem when you get to the workplace is that everything that's associated with masculinity tends to be more highly valued. That's referred to as androcentrism. So when women enter the workplace, then the forms of communicating or the ways of doing the job that are highly valued are very masculine, or stereotypically masculine ways. And when women do that, then they tend to be stigmatized or sanctioned as being bossy rather than being a leader. But if women act in appropriately feminine ways, everything that's associated with femininity is devalued, particularly in the workplace. And so if we have, education that perpetuates this sort of the gender binary, seeing men and women as opposite or very different, reinforcing those stereotypical notions of masculinity and femininity, then perhaps that can sort of carry over into how we see our coworkers or evaluate our coworkers.
The fascinating thing about what Dr. Denissen just said is that on the playground, teachers don't separate kids. The children separate themselves. But what the teachers do is they take that separation for granted. And so they reinforce the separation, but children separate themselves. When I was little and went to Catholic school, they separated us. But in the public schools, they don't separate kids that way. But the same thing tends to happen on its own with the children. And the reason why they separate themselves is, one of the reasons is they're afraid of heterosexual teasing. Because when girls and boys play together, they get teased. So it would be interesting to figure out a way to change that or to combat, because like Dr. Denissen says, it may carry over into the workplace in terms of expectations of what girls and boys are supposed to do.
And even theories of education can produce this, that if we value masculine forms of knowledge, so things like deductive reasoning from empirical fact and not from experience, focusing on consensus being the goal of any form of communication instead of perspective sharing, that also then encourages those behaviors in other places as well, such that we don't tend to value located experience. So when people say, this is my experience of oppression or discrimination, and folks say, well, what's the number? What's the proof? So demanding particular forms of knowledge is valuable versus others, seeing education or knowledge as a competitive enterprise, and so that it's either your view or mine, instead of one in which we can bring those together and share perspectives. Those are also ways that we can be gendered with how we learn, in terms of the very philosophy of teaching itself, and not only in addition to more structural factors like how we're arranged in the playground and what type of behaviors are encouraged, so that young men are encouraged to speak more than young women are, and are tracked into, young boys are told they're not as good at humanities or English and are tracked into science and technology. Even as recently as 2014, there was a study out of the UK that says that that type of tracking is still predominant in secondary schools.
So recently there have been stores like Target's one of them that have ended the gender labeling in their toy section. So instead of having boy blocks and girl blocks, they now have blocks, and they could find all the blocks there. What are your thoughts on that? Does that help the child, or is it more profitable for them to perpetuate the stereotypes? Professor Denissen, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, I think that it's a small, but I think a very positive change. I think it demonstrates that people, perhaps, some of the folks who work or make these decisions at Target, but I think even more so like consumers, because I think this was in many ways a consumer-driven change or response to consumer preferences. But it shows that more and more people are becoming aware of the gender binary. They're starting to see that it's not something that's biological or natural. It's something that we've created, we've constructed it, we've made gender in this way, and that is very limiting for both men and women, right? It kind of puts us in a little bit of a straitjacket where you only get to be half of a human being. You have to be masculine, you have to be feminine. That means half of what it means to be a human being is not open to you. So I think people are seeing that, they're becoming more aware of that, and they're criticizing it, and they're starting to speak up, and so they're asking for Target to, not have the gender segregated toys, which is, I think, a wonderful beginning, and I hope it continues from there.
What are your thoughts on?
Well, absolutely it's positive, and one of the things I really wanted to emphasize too is that it's bad for young boys and young girls, right? And that it's one of the great myths of feminism or feminist approaches to things like this is that it's not concerned with how it affects men or women, but it's equally as concerning that young boys aren't encouraged to be emotional or encouraged to show a softer side, or that think that they have to compete or be assertive and to dominate other men and women in order to succeed. And will changing toys overstop that? No, but I love the point that it demonstrates some of the arbitrariness with which we make these decisions about why we've decided certain colors are feminine and others are masculine, or why certain behaviors are feminine and certain behaviors are masculine. So it really opens up a range of things. And so if a young girl wants to play with a doll, that's okay, or if a boy wants to play with a truck, but not because they're told boys only play with trucks or girls only play with dolls. So it gives them the capacity to begin imagining the diversity of human experience.
Right, and also I think it would be good for boys to be encouraged to play with dolls.
Absolutely.
It would develop their nurturing skills, and when they grow up to be fathers, they'll take a more active role. It will help them.
Yeah.
One of many things, it will take a more active role in nurturing their children. And girls need to develop those visual spatial skills that things like Legos and Lincoln Logs and Bionicles teach them as they're building them, and that will maybe be a small step toward helping them move into fields like engineering, which is still a very male-dominated occupation.
So as a society, we have progressed immensely from past generations, but why, even though we have progress, why are we still teaching and being taught these gender stereotypes even now? Dr. Kouri.
Well, it's interesting because even though we've moved forward, all those traditional ideologies are still with us, and they're really strong, and they're really hard to, I don't know if we want to obliterate them, but change them in a way that they apply to both women and men. So researchers are always talking about how resilient they are, and what it shows us is that we have a lot more fighting to do, and a lot more work to do in terms of teaching the public that what we teach our children is not natural and normal. It's created by people. It's socially constructed, and so we need to give our children more leeway in terms of their behaviors and the toys, and even the clothes they wear.
I think it's really two things, and in addition to all of those things that demonstrate how resilient they are, it's that in part, it is, Judith Lorber writes this great article called Believing is Seeing in the 1990s, and says that we tend to trust visual evidence and that we make meaning out of observed differences. And so I think that too often, because we've been trained so long to see these differences, that if we see boys or girls acting in those stereotypical ways, we say, oh, see? That's boys being boys, or that's girls being girls, even though we're confronted with evidence that there's much more variation within gender, so within masculinity or between men, than there are between men and women, that science tells us that variation is much larger, but we don't notice all the ways that we're similar. We notice the ways that we're different. And so I think it calls us back to the expectations that we're given, and it's that they're given to us in so many different places. As if it was just toys, but nowhere else, then it would be really easy to challenge it. But if you hear it when you go to church, and you hear it when you go to school, and you hear it when you open a magazine and read a novel and go on the internet and check Facebook, and all of those different plays, that once you start to make headway in one of those areas, those same ideologies and ideas are present in other areas. So I love the idea that we need to keep fighting and keep thinking about it.
Yes, but it can also be patriarchy.
Oh, absolutely.
Because patriarchy benefits men at the expense of women because it keeps women out of the competition. And we still live in a patriarchal society. Men still make the major decisions. And so what may happen, I don't know, I can't predict, but if women move into more positions of power, then maybe the ideologies will start to change.
And it benefits some men over others, right? It benefits
absolutely,
white,
right.
straight, middle
Absolutely.
class, cisgendered men far more than others.
Just
So-
like racism benefits whites at the expense of people of
Exactly.
color.
Exactly. So, it's,
Right.
so looking at all of the different places where
Right.
I love the idea that it's a lot more work to do. Right? So you're absolutely right. Progress.
Yeah.
That's why teaching these things, having conversations like these on
Right.
television,
Yeah, absolutely.
radio that folks will watch, that I think becomes really important. We got to talk about it.
Right.
And how, oh, sorry. Go on. Yeah.
I think the process of distinction that you brought up in discussing patriarchy, I think, is really important. And so, that there's a difference isn't the problem. It's when difference is transformed into distinction, which is when we use difference to create hierarchies, when we use difference to say that one group is superior to or better than another group. And I think gender is one of these differences that we've created that is used to create distinctions, to argue that one group is superior to another. And that is used to protect privilege and power for some groups over others, including some groups of women over other groups of women, and some groups of men over other groups of men, and certainly men over women. And to threaten that power, to change that, and hopefully with the goal of moving to a more equitable and just society, I think is, it challenges powerful groups. It can be a different thing to do.
Absolutely.
And then in addition to that, on the flip side of the distinction part, I think there's also the pleasure part of gender, that a lot of us derive a lot of pleasure from doing gender, right? Like I derive a lot of pleasure from, like I'm in a fairly gendered, outfit. I'm dressed, like a woman. I have, makeup on. And I derive a lot of pleasure from that and a number of other things. And so I think it's important for people to understand that we don't have to give up the pleasure of doing the things that perhaps we've associated them with masculine or femininity. We don't have to give up the pleasure of doing those things just because we want to challenge gender inequality or gender oppression. Like we can get rid of the distinction, the patriarchy. We don't necessarily have to get rid of all the differences and our enjoyment in performing gender in whatever particular way we might enjoy.
And by the same token, though, men should be able to wear makeup if they want to, and women should have the choice not to wear it if they want. It should be more fluid.
Absolutely.
Because humans have been painting their bodies for years and years, and over different time periods, in different cultures, men have been allowed to paint their bodies and wear makeup. But in this particular epoch, they're not.
Well, and even not only is there pleasure in gendered performance, but there's pleasure in privilege. I mean, if there's a patriarchal bargain and it says, look, if you do these things for patriarchy, you will be rewarded with higher pay, and you will be encouraged to take jobs that have a much shorter life expectancy and are much more dangerous. But the flip side of that is you get more social value. So you ask, why is it resilient? Because we like to get rid of the big, overwhelming examples of sexism, but in everyday acts of sexism, there's still privilege and the choice to decide if I want to call myself doctor or professor, knowing that masculine privilege will make it more likely for me to be seen as an expert without having to call attention to my degree. There's pleasure in that. And so recognizing that we need to take stock of the ways that it's harmful to participate in some of that privilege, I think is also a really important part of it, because otherwise it doesn't encourage groups that have privilege to give it up if it's only seen as beneficial or useful for them.
What do you think has to be done in order to end gender roles? Is there anything that can be done, or are we ever going to end with gender roles? Dr. Kephart, I'll start with you.
Well, I don't think gender roles are something that can end, in the sense that we're talking a lot about socialization, but there are some biological ways in which we respond to things like different chemicals that are in higher proportion in the bodies, or different biological functions of male or female bodies. The issue is less about get rid of gender roles and more about stop positively valencing some at the expense of others. Right? So that for example, we think of testosterone as a male hormone, and it tends to be higher in men than women but it also tends to be higher in women in highly competitive jobs than it is in men in less competitive jobs. And so it's not that we'll be able to get rid of gender, but instead stop saying this gender is better than this gender, or this sex has to perform this gendered behavior or this gender role, and is more about things we've all been talking about, giving more range of options and equal valuation towards different behaviors.
In some societies, they have more than two genders. They've constructed a third or even a fourth gender, like the British, in the American Indian Society. So, you know, we also might think, think about, and I don't know how it would work, but maybe creating other genders, because it's really hard for atypical males, atypical, I don't mean it that way, but a lot of males have a hard time fitting into the aggressive masculine standard that we have in the US. So we need to make gender roles more flexible. You can be male or female by not conforming to these rigid notions of what a male or female should be, or also maybe creating other genders, like the British.
Seeing as a spectrum or a continuum,
right,
instead of either or.
Professor Denissen, do you have any last to add?
Oh, yeah. Well, I agree. These are lovely points. I think it's important, you guys have hinted at some of this, but I think recognizing that, again, that gender is something that we've socially constructed, and that means that how our understandings of gender have changed, not definitely cross-culturally, but also historically. Like, even how any group within a particular culture, how they do gender, it has changed over time, and it will change. How we do gender now is not how we're going to do gender in the future. And so we don't need to hold on to it so tightly or rigidly. It is changing, it is going to change. So be open to that change, allow for that to occur. It doesn't need to feel threatening, it can even feel fun or enjoyable. So I think moving towards, gender fluidity, or allowing for greater variety of genders and gender expression. And I think some of the things, concrete things that individual people could do have to do with their own gender policing. So one of the things that we do as individuals is we police each other's gender, right? We hold them accountable for meeting our gender expectations. And oftentimes that's based on stereotypes. So we can choose not to engage in gender policing. We can even choose to speak up when we see other people being gender policed, and you have to be careful there, because there are sanctions for speaking up against that. So you have to, pick and choose your battles, of course, especially when you feel safe. But the more you can do that, the more you can not gender police yourself, the more you can speak up when other people are being gender policed, and instead voice an attitude of, gender tolerance and embracing, a variety and a diversity of genders and, gender expressions. I think all those things are very helpful.
Well, thank you guys so much. That's all the time we have. Thank you for joining us once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at CSUN On Point. Sunday mornings, you can watch us on LA Channel 36 at 11:30. And you can listen on KCSN 88.5 FM at 5:30 in the morning. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Sarah Vong.